evening from Piraeus here in Greece. I'm very happy that we have John Hendrix with us in the IPT Talk series, and it is on a very important topic about Plotinus, a Neoplatonic philosopher, and John is going to speak about the concept of the unconscious in Plotinus philosophy. A few words about Professor Hendrix. John is a professor of art and architectural history. He currently teaches at the Roger Williams University in Rhode Island. And he also been a professor at Rhode Island School of Design, the University of Lincoln in the UK, and John Cabot University. He's a prolific writer. He has written several books on architecture, aesthetics, philosophy, and psychoanalysis, with a very important contribution in Neoplatonic scholarship. John, thank you for your presentation today in advance and for accepting our invitation. The stage is yours.
Thank you, Jonas, very much. So I'll just read slightly revised passages from the book Unconscious Thought in Philosophy and Psychoanalysis from about 10 years ago. So that'll take about half an hour. And feel free to interrupt me at any time. I hope it's not too monotonous. So this is Plotinus, the first philosopher of the unconscious. Plotinus is sometimes referred to as the first philosopher of the unconscious. In his 1960 essay, Consciousness and Unconsciousness in Plotinus, Hans Rudolf Schweitzer called Plotinus the discoverer of the unconscious. In the same year, Eric Robertson Dodds wrote that in the thought of Plotinus, there are sensations which do not reach consciousness, and there are desires that are unknown to us. In 1965, Dodds wrote, Plotinus was the first writer to recognize that the psyche includes sensations, desires, and dispositions of which the ego is normally unconscious. In the Meno and Phaedo, Plato suggested that we have knowledge of which we are not aware at the moment in anamnesis. But Plotinus was the first writer to address the thought of which we are not aware and incorporate it into a philosophy of intellect. What exactly was Plotinus's unconscious? In the thought of Plotinus, seen as the first philosopher to develop a systematic conception of the presence of unconscious thought and conscious thought, or a systematic philosophy of intellect involving unconscious thought, concepts that contribute to a theory of unconscious thought include the nous poetikos, or noetic thought or intellect, the intelligible, fantasia or imagination, and the logos endiathitos, or the unuttered word, which aids in translating the intelligible into the presentation of it available to discursive reason or conscious thought. Plotinus did not use the word unconscious. It was introduced as the German Unbewusst by Friedrich Schelling in the system of transcendental idealism in 1800. It was a popular concept among Romantic writers and was developed into a philosophy by Ernst Plattner in Philosophical Aphorisms in 1776 and Edward von Hartmann in The Philosophy of the Unconscious in 1869. Roots of the concept can also be found in Leibniz, Kant, and Hegel. The study of the unconscious was turned into a kind of science by Sigmund Freud, beginning with the interpretation of dreams in 1900, and further developed as a science of the letter by Jacques Lacan and theories of psychoanalysis in the 20th century. Both Freud and Lacan attempted to present psychoanalysis as something other than philosophy, which supposedly depends on conscious thought knowing everything about itself, but that is clearly not the case in the philosophy of Plotinus. There is an element of thought not known to conscious thought, described by Plotinus, which became the unconscious. In the Aeneid, Plotinus asked about soul and intellect. Why then do we not consciously grasp them, but are mostly inactive in these ways, and some of us are never active at all. For not everything which is in the soul is immediately perceptible, he said. In the De Anima of Aristotle, mind does not think intermittently. We cannot remember eternal mind in us because passive mind is perishable. Is the productive intelligence in our mind that of which we are not conscious? Can productive intelligence be compared to unconscious thought? Plotinus suggests that we do not notice the activity of intellect because it is not engaged with objects of sense perception. The intellect must involve an activity prior to awareness. Awareness of intellectual activity only occurs when thinking is reflected as in a mirror, but knowledge and discursive reason transitioning from one object to the next in a temporal sequence, is not self-knowledge. Only in the activity of intellect inaccessible to discursive reason is thinking as the equivalent of being. The intellectual act in mind is only apprehensible when it is brought into the image-making power of mind through the logos or linguistic articulation. Quote, we are always intellectually active, but do not always apprehend our activity. If the intellectual is the unconscious, then unconscious reason is superior to conscious reason. The inability of conscious reason to know itself in the illusion of consciousness is the premise of psychoanalysis in the 20th century. In the Aeneids, the human mind or soul sometimes reasons about the right and good and sometimes does not. If this is the case, then there must be an element of thought which knows what the right and good are, not intermittently and indecisively, but permanently and without question. This must be intellect, which rather than reason discursively about the right and the good, possesses the right and the good based on the principle and cause of intellect. The principle and cause of intellect is undivided in discursive reason and abides in mind but not in place. As such, the principle and cause can remain undivided, just as the center of a circle remains undivided by the individual radii connected to it. Why then, Plotinus asks, when we have such great possessions, do we not consciously grasp them, but are mostly inactive in these ways, and some of us are never active at all? Intellect, what comes before intellect, or the first cause, and what results from intellect, or soul, which is itself ever moving, are all always occupied in their own activities, but those activities are not always perceptible. They are only perceptible when they somehow enter into perception, when their activity is shared. Since we are mostly preoccupied with our activities of perception, it is difficult to be aware of when the activities of intellect are shared. Nevertheless, when the activities are shared with perception, then, quote, conscious awareness takes place. Otherwise, we are unconscious of the activities of intellect and discursive or conscious reason. We are not aware of the role that unconscious thought plays in the activities of our conscious thought and perception. In order to become aware of the activities of unconscious thought or intellect, quote, we must turn our power of apprehension inwards and make it attend to what is there. First, it is necessary to examine one's soul. The powers of perception of soul are only capable of perceiving external objects. Discursive reason and soul makes judgments based on the mental images which come from sense perception. The mental images come from sensible objects and are organized by reason in combinations and divisions. It should be kept in mind that the mental images themselves are not entirely dependent on the sensible forms, though, because the mental images play a role in the determination of the sensible forms to begin with, and the result is not just the sensible form imprinted in the mind's eye, but a combination of the sensible form and the intelligible form. As Plotinus said, quote, as for the things which come to it from intellect, the intelligible forms, it observes what one might call their imprints and has the same power also in dealing with these. Understanding and perception on the part of reason is the result of a dialectical process of combinations as sensible and intelligible forms in the mind, which is an unconscious process. Any knowledge or awareness of this process can only come from intellect and not discursive reason and soul. But a part of intellect has to be in soul, just as a part of the Aristotelian active intellect has to be in potential intellect. The part of intellect which is in soul, though, does not have the capacity of pure intellect to be aware of itself. Self-awareness in soul can only come from intellect higher than soul, intellect not connected to the body or sense perception. In other words, conscious reason cannot know itself. This is in contradiction of the Cartesian premise of modern philosophy, a premise that was refuted by Kant, Schelling, and Hegel. Discursive reason and soul cannot know itself or have self-awareness, but it can know where it is, somewhere between intellect and sense perception. Discursive or conscious reason, quote, has understanding of the impressions which it receives from both sides, from intellect and sense perception. It can be aware of what it receives from perception, and it can be aware of what it receives from intellect, the higher forms to which it has access. How does conscious reason have such understanding? In the Enneads, impressions are received by discursive reason from sense perception, but discursive reason can only respond to them with the help of memory. With the help of memory, discursive reason then performs analytical operations on the impressions from sense perception, quote, taking to pieces what the image-making power gave it. Any judgments that discursive reason makes about what it receives from sense perception can only be the result of what is already in discursive reason. In order for discursive reason to make any particular judgment about something perceived, discursive reason has to contain the quality that it judges. The only way that discursive reason can contain a quality is if it is illuminated by intellect, as the sun would illuminate an object in vision. Discursive reason is not conscious of the illumination of intellect, of the reception of the reflection of intellect as in a mirror, because again it is too engaged in perceiving and judging external objects. Only intellect is capable of observing and knowing itself, which is a kind of reason inaccessible to discursive or conscious reason. Discursive reason makes use of intellect unknowingly in perception and logical thought, when discursive reason is in accord with intellect and can be affected by it. Discursive reason is only in accord with intellect to the extent that discursive reason has knowledge of such accord. In other words, unconscious thought can only be known in conscious thought. While impressions are received through sense perception, quote, it is not we ourselves who are the perceivers, because the mechanisms that allow perception to take place from intellect are not accessible by conscious thought. We can define ourselves and have self-identity only in our conscious discursive reason, not in the unconscious mechanisms behind perception, and not in the unconscious mechanisms of intellect. Thus, quote, we are this, the principal part of soul, in the middle between two powers, neither of which is accessible to our knowledge or awareness. Thus, our self-knowledge and identity can be described as being caught between two mirrors. We can perceive the reflections of sense perception and intellect, but we cannot see beyond the source of the reflections. We do not notice the activity of intellect because, quote, it is not concerned with any object of sense, as Plotinus said in Enneads 1:4-10. We are generally only aware of our mind's activity when it is connected to sense perception and thinking about the object of sense, the nous heiligos. If intellect and soul are understood to come before sense perception and discursive reason as necessary ground for those activities, then it must be considered that the activities of intellect and soul are continually active in making sense perception and discursive reason possible, although we do not have immediate awareness of or access to those activities. Quote, there must be an activity prior to awareness, said Plotinus, if thinking and being are the same. That is, if being is given by thought. Where an awareness of the activity of intellect exists or is produced, intellectual activity is reflected back to conscious thought as in a mirror reflection, perhaps at an angle, since the activity of intellect itself is not present to the dianoetic self, in front of the mirror as it were. Or the activity of intellect is reflected back to dianoetic thought as logos, since the lower soul can only perceive it as such. In order for that to happen, the surface of the mirror has to be clear, Or in other words, the power of soul has to be clear of disturbances or distractions from sense perceptions. It is necessary for the individual to not be distracted by or focused on the objects of sense perception in order to disconnect the mind's activities from them and concentrate it on the premises for the possibilities of those sense perceptions. It is in self-consciousness that the mind is able to perceive the unconscious activity, which makes conscious activity possible. What is reflected as a mirror image, which is a function of the image-making power or imagination or fantasia in soul, is the activity of intellect, which must always be there, whether the mirror reflects it or not. The reflective power of the mirror needs to be turned on through the will of thinking, and the mirror needs to function correctly. It is not possible to have direct access to the activities of intellect or unconscious thought, but only to their reflections in soul or conscious thought. In the same way, it is not possible to have direct access to dreams, but only to their images as preserved by memory in waking conscious life. Memory serves the image-making power to preserve images and translate them into words, so that the images, which are the product of sense perception, can play a role as the vocabulary elements of thinking activity and discursive reason. When the mirror imaging power of imagination is functioning correctly, the activity and images of intellect, what is prior to sense perception, can be perceived by soul in the same way that objects of sense perception are perceived by sight, although the light by which they are illuminated is not the light of the sun, but rather an inner light, the light of intellect itself. In order for the activities and images of intellect to be perceived in the same way as sense objects, they have to mimic or take the form of sense objects and activities. Unconscious thought can only be known by conscious thought to the extent that it mimics conscious thought and conforms to its boundaries and limitations. The full extent of unconscious thought cannot be known by conscious thought because of the limitations of conscious thought, just like the full extent of the sensible world cannot be known by sense perception because of the limitations of sense perception. On this premise alone, the existence of the metaphysical is necessary. The operation of the mirror of self-reflection, or self-consciousness of intellectual activity, depends on the smooth functioning, harmony and balance of the body in relation to the sensible world. The mirror is a property of nous heiligos, the physical functioning of mind in relation to body. If the body does not function properly, the self-reflexive powers of mind cannot function properly. This is in contradiction to the thought of Plato. If the mirror is broken because the body is not functioning properly, there is no image for thought and intellect to operate with. The image-making power or imagination is also a property of nous heiligos and bodily function in the sensible, although it is also a property of intellect, and in fact was seen by Plotinus as occupying the midpoint between intellect and sense perception. But for these purposes, the mirror in the mind, as a property of the body, is necessary for the mind to perceive the activities of intellect in connection with images, the images reflected in the well-functioning mirror of the soul. The activity of intellect itself does not necessarily involve a connection with images, but its connection with images is necessary in order to be perceived. According to Plotinus, there are, quote, a great many valuable activities, theoretical and practical, which we carry on both in our contemplative and active life, even when we are fully conscious, which do not make us aware of them. This is an explicit recognition of the existence of the modern concept of the unconscious. It is possible to be involved in an activity or an act of contemplation, virtuous action or reading, for example, without being aware of such activity or thought. In fact, conscious awareness, according to Plotinus, quote, is likely to enfeeble the very activities of which there is consciousness. Plotinus seemed to be suggesting that there is something stronger and superior in mind to conscious thought, which is intellect. Conscious thought and activity, and consciousness itself, are weak forms of thought and activity. Nowhere in the Enneads did Plotinus suggest the possibility or concept of a higher consciousness, contrary to the opinion of some commentators. Instead, Plotinus said that, quote, only when they are alone, referring to the activities of thought of which there is consciousness, are they pure and more genuinely active and living. Thoughts are stronger and purer when they are alone, when they are unperceived by conscious thought and perception, when they are what we call unconscious. Thoughts are pure before they have been connected to the images which allow them to be perceptible to consciousness. They are closer to their source, the one in intellect. They are purer as the prior ground for consciousness and experience and sense perception. The unconscious is the pure ground for conscious thought and activity, and unconscious thoughts are necessarily corrupted when they become conscious thoughts, if just in their connection to the image in imagination. The power of imagination is the great facilitator for Plotinus, but also the great corrupter. The value of life is increased, and the quality of the soul is increased when mind is less fragmented and dispersed in the acts of sense perception and discursive reason, but rather, quote, gathered together in one in itself. Conscious thought and sense perception involve a fragmentation, dispersal, and diminution of the powers of thought. In order to avoid this fragmentation and diminution of thought, it is necessary to will oneself into self-reflection and to will one's intellect away from the objects of sense perception toward the images of intellect reflected in soul, then away from those images to the prior source of the images and intellect. It is necessary to will oneself towards one's unconscious. The more access there is to the unconscious activities of one's mind, the stronger and purer are the conscious activities. As John Gale recently wrote, quote, according to Neoplatonism, the analytic withdrawal into the psyche demanded an examination of unconscious desire, which amounted to a therapeutic process. For Plotinus, withdrawal was a kind of catharsis, a breaking through the ego to get in touch with excluded, disassociated parts of the self. Plotinus also called the reflections of the images of intellect imprints or impressions, so they are seen as the eidos or form which is not connected to a material form or morphe, in the same way that the images of sense perception themselves are the eidos and not the morphe, imprints or impressions of forms that are received in connection to the material objects, as if there are two lights or a double light shining on the material object, the light of the intelligible, which illuminates the eidos, and the light of the sensible, or the sun, which illuminates matter. Judgment and discursive reason is based on the perception of the eidos of the sensible object, as it is subjected to the mechanisms of combination and division in apperception, which are the same mechanisms which Sigmund Freud attributed to the image-making power of unconscious thought and the formation of dream images from dream thoughts, what he called condensation and displacement. The judgment and discursive reason is also based on the perception of the image connected to thoughts from intellect, as the objects of sense perception are processed through the unconscious mechanisms of imagination and memory, which make the sense perception possible in the first place, then translate the objects of sense perception into a totality, or what Immanuel Kant would call the manifold, even through the combinations and divisions, which makes being possible and which makes thinking equivalent to being. Thinking for Plotinus is a dialectical process which is facilitated by imagination, which is suspended between intellect, the source of thinking, and sense perception, the object of thinking. The dialectical process involves the imprint of the sense object or sensible form in perception, the imprint of the idea of the object or intelligible form in the imagination or image-making power, the memory or recollection of past thoughts and perceptions in relation to the present thought, the recollections of the soul, the transformation of the image, both sensible and intelligible, into the word and language, both the spoken word and the word prior to speech and intellect, and the fitting together of sensible image, intelligible image, recollected sensible image, recollected intelligible image, sensible word, and intelligible word in a process which requires the anticipation of the perception of the image or word in relation to the recollection of the intelligible image or word in intellect, as it is perceived as a reflection or imprint in mind. Human thinking is very complicated. When the soul is, quote, in the intelligible world, it has itself, too, the characteristic of unchangeability, but if it comes out of the intelligible world and cannot endure unity, but embraces its own individuality and wants to be different, It then acquires memory in discursive reason and temporal succession. Memory helps keep the soul partly in the intelligible world, the rational soul, but it also brings soul down to the sensible world, the irrational soul. As the perception of a sensible object entails both the eidos of the object and the eidos of the intelligible idea of the object in unconscious thought, quote, actual seeing is double, according to Plotinus. The eye, quote, has one object of sight, which is the form of the object perceived by the sense, and one which is the medium through which the form of its object is perceived. The medium, the intelligible idea of the object, which comes from intellect, and is connected to the imprint that is reflected in the mirror of the mind's eye, precedes the perception of the sensible form and is the cause of the perception of the sensible form. In normal conscious thought and perception, the form and the medium cannot be separated, and the form of the sensible object is unknowingly perceived as a sensible object without its sensible or intelligible form. While vision and sense perception is distracted in the act of perception of an object, it is not capable of self-reflection in its outer act. Intellect is, quote, that which is actually and always intellect. It thinks from itself and derives the content of its thought from itself, and it is itself what it thinks. This defines its actuality as opposed to its potentiality. In the Deinema of Aristotle, mind is separable and passive and unmixed, an originating cause identical to its object of knowledge. In isolation, mind or intellect, quote, is its true self and nothing more, and this alone is immortal and everlasting, and without this nothing thinks. For Plotinus, intellect both thinks the real beings, intelligible forms, and is the real beings. It is necessary that, quote, primary reality is not what is perceived by the senses, as in the allegory of the cave in the Republic of Plato, because, quote, the form of the matter and the things of sense is an image of the real form, the archetypal or intelligible form known to conscious reason as a reflection, and a likeness of the intelligible form with which it is connected. Intellect is composed of rational forming principles, which precede not only visible forms, but also the mechanisms of soul, which can only be potential. As in the Deinema of Aristotle, two distinct elements must be present in soul, like everything in nature. Imagination facilitates the translation of sensible objects in perception to intellection. Following Aristotle, the intellectual act is not possible without an accompanied mental image, according to Plotinus. The power to form the image in the mind's eye is conversely always accompanied by the, quote, verbal expression, or more accurately, the logos and diathetos, the word and thought, as Plotinus intended it. The intelligible image, and thus the sensible image, is not possible without the linguistic expression of it, and linguistic expression is not possible without the intelligible image. Perception of sensible objects is only possible after the idea of the sensible object is articulated in language and intellection. While the, quote, intellectual act is without parts, as it has not been differentiated in discursive reason, and thus in perception, it, quote, has not, so to speak, come out into the open, but remains unobserved within as unconscious thought. But, quote, the verbal expression unfolds its content and brings it out of the intellectual act into the image-making power, unquote, allowing imagination to form the intelligible image which corresponds to the sensible image in memory. In doing so, the linguistic articulation, quote, shows the intellectual act as if in a mirror, as a mirror reflection might represent a sensible object, but the linguistic articulation and discursive reason does not contain the intellectual act. The intellectual act must remain separated from sense perception and sensible reality. The intellectual act itself is inaccessible as the unconscious. In the same way, it might be said that conscious thought contains a reflection or representation of unconscious thought, but conscious thought does not contain unconscious thought. Unconscious thought is inaccessible to conscious thought. The intellectual act, the intelligible activity of the soul, is only apprehended through a reflection or representation, quote, when it comes to be in the image-making power, as an intelligible form in the imagination produced through perception, language, and memory, or as a dream image. quote, the intellectual act is one thing, inaccessible in the unconscious, but the apprehension of it is another, through the representation and the mirror reflection of the representation in the logos or word and thought. Thus, while we were always intellectually active, including while we were sleeping, we do not always apprehend our activity because we are distracted by our conscious thought and sense perceptions. That which apprehends the act of intelligence, the imagination, also apprehends perceptions, which are necessary for the apprehension of intellectual acts and imagination. Both word and image together are necessary for comprehension. Conscious thought prevents the apprehension of unconscious thought, as discursive reason prevents apprehension of the intellectual. The imaginative faculty is a unitary activity which unites the sensible in perception and the intelligible in intellection, but it seems to be fragmented because of the lack of conscious apprehension of all of its activities. In conclusion, the philosophy of Plotinus is rich in concepts that suggest unconscious thought, as has been noted by a number of scholars. Plotinian philosophy laid an important groundwork for the philosophy of intellect of the Peripatetics in a combination of Plato and Aristotle, which is precedent Plotinus. This philosophical position persisted as a dominant way of thinking until the Renaissance. As the classical tradition ceased to be dominant, modern philosophy began with figures such as Leibniz and Kant, who developed a different epistemological framework that led directly to the psychoanalytic concept of unconscious thought. Many of the tenets of the modern tradition can nevertheless be found in the classical tradition. Plotinus' interest in the unconscious, as we call it, was for the benefit of the growth and development of the individual. With the Freudian science of psychoanalysis in the 20th century, the concept of the unconscious is taken on a different meaning as the source of conflict and discord in conscious thought and activity, and as the source of cures and solutions for that conflict and discord. Psychoanalysts have turned the unconscious into a storehouse of memories and experiences, and the unconscious is no longer seen as a pure form of thought that can be accessed by each individual in order to grow and develop in thought and action, as Plotinus clearly intended it to be. Perhaps a return to the concept of the unconscious in Plotinus could add a great deal to the practice of psychoanalysis today. Thank you.
Thank you, John, very much for your presentation. It was indeed very interesting and rich in information about how Plotinus' conception of the unconscious really goes throughout the history of philosophy, but also comes to the modern psychoanalytic tradition, but also how it revolves in different areas of Plotinus' central ideas, metaphysics and psychology, philosophy of mind, and the place of intellect in this connection. I would like to ask our participants to pose any questions that they would like to Professor Hendrix. Are there any questions? Yes. Dan, yes, please.
Yeah, hi.
Hi.
I hope you can hear me well. So my question is basically,
Yes.
I'm interested in finding out which role the unconscious plays in creative processes. And I'm wondering, as you already said, Freud's account of the unconscious is very different from Plotinus's, in the sense that while for Plotinus it's basically pure reason, or like even the one, or the intellect, as you said, which is sort of unconscious. For Freud, it's rather sort of anything but reason, which is unconscious. And I'm wondering, particularly in the arts, sort of, what would you think Plotinus would have to say about the role that the unconscious plays there, in particular, because he's also been referenced a lot by mystics such as Pseudo Dionysius and so on. And on the other hand, what would you think Freud has to say? I mean, that's a rather large question, so feel free to answer whatever aspect of it you deem appropriate.
Well, I think that Plotinus is the first philosopher of the unconscious. I also think he's the first philosopher of the artistic imagination. John Dillon has said this in an essay about Plotinus, that our concepts of artistic imagination originate with Plotinus, and particularly the role of the imagination that I discussed briefly, that sort of exists halfway between intellect and discursive reason, and is responsible for transferring, the intellectual ideas to sensible sense perceptions and connecting them back to them, so that Plotinus sees the imagination as being the great connector, but also the great corrupter, because it's corrupting the pure ideas and sense perceptions and not allowing us to get further access to the pure ideas. But I think obviously Plotinus had a great deal of interest in the arts. He was probably the first philosopher to have such an interest. Plato didn't have much interest in the visual arts at all. Plotinus had a great deal of interest in the visual arts. He loved the visual arts. He uses them all the time, metaphorically, to make points. So it's easy to see why he would be a source of ideas about the artistic imagination as they would develop further. I think that Freud's ideas about the unconscious are very different. Psychoanalysis is very different, and a lot of Freud's ideas come from Plato and Aristotle and Plotinus and classical philosophers. But it's for a completely different purpose and in a completely different time frame. I mean, Freud was mostly interested, as he started out, in trying to cure patients suffering from war trauma. And so he was mostly interested in psychical disturbances, which Plotinus wasn't particularly interested in. But Plotinus did say that you have to have a healthy body to have a healthy mind. That was a key aspect in Plotinus, I think. And Freud was mostly concerned with bodies and minds that were not healthy at all, and that's what modern psychoanalysis is mostly concerned with as a practice, rather than as a philosophy. Freud, Lacan, the other psychoanalysts, they didn't want to have their discipline seen as a philosophy. They wanted to distance themselves from philosophy because they saw philosophy as presenting, they saw conscious thought as thinking that it can understand itself. I mean, that's sort of the premise of philosophy, is that conscious thought can understand itself. And the main premises of Freudian psychoanalysis is that conscious thought cannot understand itself. So he saw, although he appropriated a lot of ideas from philosophy, he sort of set himself as sort of the opposite camp from philosophy, as do other psychoanalysts. So it's when you try to incorporate philosophical ideas into psychoanalysis and vice versa, it can be you can get some opposition to that.
Yeah, I recall Freud calling himself the anti-philosopher. Yeah, thanks a lot for your answer.
Thank you.
Thank you, John, and thank you for your question, Dan. Actually, any other question about our talk today?
Can you share the title? Can you share the title of the article, please? I mean, the information on the article, Dylan.
About John Dillon's article, you mean, about artistic imagination?
Yeah, the one. Yeah, I wanted to look it up. Thank you so much.
I'll see if I can find it real quick.
Okay.
I'd like to ask a question.
Yes, please.
Just a clarification. Thank you for your thought. I appreciate you putting together this. And it brings to mind some, I don't know, always ambiguity and uncertainty or non-understanding on my part, having to do with the relationship or the distinction maybe between nous poeticos and the fantasia. That always is a troublesome sorting out process. I don't understand the difference too well. So maybe you could help me a little bit with that.
So the nous poeticos is the intellect, the noesis, the higher intellect from the divided line of Plato, the intellect that is connected to, in Aristotle's words, a universal intellect, or in Plato's words, the archetypal intellect, the permanent divine intellect. And so the opposite of the nous poeticos would be the nous patheticos, which is the discursive reason, the kind of reason that is only connected to sense perception. And that's the distinction that was the basis of, medieval scholasticism with the trivium and the quadrivium, and then through the Renaissance and humanism, it dominated all classical, medieval, and Renaissance philosophical traditions. So the fantasia is something different. The fantasia is imagination, the function of the imagination, which is a separate function defined by Plotinus, which it plays a key role in connecting those two together, connects the higher intellect, the nous poeticos, with the discursive reason, the nous patheticos, by functioning to transform perceived images with the eidos, which are already sort of constructed by language to begin with, to transform and then transform the thoughts from the logos into the images. That's a sort of portal that connects the nous poeticos and the nous patheticos. And actually, Freud, in that way, Freud was similar, because Freud, in the interpretation of dreams, said that when you fall asleep, you don't stop thinking; you're still thinking, and when you wake up, you have image memories of dreams. Whether you actually had them or not, who knows? But you have the memories of them. So what Freud said was that as you're dreaming, the thoughts that you're having in your head get transformed into the images and the dreams. So all of the images have some connection with words that are going through your head, and they get jumbled up through the processes of condensation and displacement. So that's actually exactly what Plotinus says. That's Plotinus's imagination, transforming the thought into the image, the logos and the eidos, making the connection between the logos and the eidos, which is what allows us to think. In psychoanalysis, a good way to define psychosis is the inability to connect the word and the image. If you lose that ability, then that's what the experience of psychosis is in psychoanalysis.
Thank you. So a related kind of conception is the relationship of the fetish to, in Freud, as the cover image or the substitution, right? The displacement of what is standard interpretation to a very particular individual. It's not comprehension, but it is an individual way of putting an image together, or something, bringing together the phanta, not with language so much, but with something that's satisfying and fulfilling in terms of a, I don't know, it just holds a place. It's like a placeholder for understanding or intellect, it seems to me.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that's kind of an interesting way of putting it, that a sense perception or discursive reason can be a kind of a fetish object for the intelligible thought and mind. I mean, that, of course, that's a core idea in psychoanalysis, is that we don't have access to we don't understand ourselves, and we don't have access to our desires. We're sort of, what Freud called das Ding, the thing. There's a void around which desire circulates. So our lives are filled with fetish objects, which are objects which stand in for our desires, which we long to have access to, but we don't have access to them. So we transfer them. I have a desire to drink a Coca-Cola. That's because it takes the place of the desire that I can't have access to.
Thank you again. Yes.
Any other question? Thank you for this very interesting discussion about that. Any other question? We have a few more minutes.
So I actually wanted to add, I don't know if I should.
Yes, please.
If someone else has something, I'm coming from the outside, so I would maybe I'll write to John and get the article reference.
Give me a second. I'll go get it.
Oh dear, I didn't mean for him to leave.
No, but it's very interesting. In the unconscious way.
We can do that later because the time is running out, John. So
I have it right here. There's a new book, The Legacy of Neoplatonic Philosophy, just came out.
Okay.
It's in here.
Can you hold it up and I will take a picture of it, but I'll probably remember this.
Okay.
So
Yeah, I have this is my essay, Plotinus and the Artistic Imagination. And this is the book edited by Gina Zapota, The Legacy of Neoplatonic Philosophy.
I see. Okay.
So the reference to the Dylan article
I
is
turn my camera on. I don't know
in
how
here.
terrible I am, but yeah. So anyway, I just wanted to say that I come from this at a very different angle. I come at this from the angle of medieval cartography. In particular, I come at it from the angle of medieval Islamic cartography, and I believe that Plotinus really influenced, at least in the Islamic context, the development of medieval cartography, the Islamic trajectory. But I think it's also within the medieval context, and listening to you speak really helped me actually. So anyway,
through the concept of the artistic imagination.
Well, through what you were talking about, which is the need to express it, right?
Yeah.
The need to get to an icon, the need to your words exactly. I have to listen to this whole time. I'm glad it's being recorded. I'm going to listen to it again very slowly. But you said this thing about how it's to do with perception that translates to an image, right? That's Plotinus's major contribution, right? That's how you boiled it down.
Yeah, the word and the image connecting. Yeah.
Yeah, that's fabulous. That's absolutely. I really think that fits with my reading of how important Plotinus was for the development of medieval cartography. So
the article by John Dillon is called Plotinus and the Transcendental Imagination.
Okay, let me write this down. Plotinus and the Transcendental Imagination. This is wonderful.
And it's in a book called Religious Imagination.
Thank you so much. That's great.
Thank you for your question. Please turn off the microphone if it's possible. There's kind of an echo. Yes, Christos Sideras wants to ask a question. Yes, Christo.
Yeah, thank you so much. It's really interesting, really beautiful work, and I look forward to delving into it more. I have sort of backgrounds in psychoanalysis and philosophy. I was gonna very quickly share a little quote, although there could be many things that could be said about the kind of Lacanian approach, which you mentioned as well, in terms of the logocentric, if you would like, understanding of the unconscious, as opposed, for example, a Jungian one, which is more image-centric. But I'll read you a quote from Jung: "A psychology that satisfies the intellect alone can never be practical, for the totality of the psyche can never be grasped by intellect alone. Whether we will or no, philosophy keeps breaking through, because the psyche seeks an expression that will embrace its total nature." I only mentioned it because I put it in my thesis as well, because I mean, it may be a different understanding of philosophy, but I think it is somewhat resonant to what you were saying, and I wonder if you have anything to say about that, in that sense that there is a wholeness in the philosophical thinking that does go beyond, I think Jung appreciates. I mean, Jung perhaps more than Lacan or Bion, who they certainly had Platonic thought come through. I would think that Jung is probably the one that more in depth kind of read the Neoplatonic / Gnostic tradition and used that as a resource, I think, for his thinking. I wonder what you think about this sort of philosophy kind of being in touch with the whole rather than the part or the daimonic, if that makes sense. The consciousness, as you put it.
Yeah. I think that's a good argument for philosophy and the role that philosophy should play in psychoanalysis. I agree with that for sure. Yeah, it's more whole. I mean, I think that when psychoanalysts say that, I mean, they don't display a very good knowledge of Plotinus anyway. They're talking about a Cartesian kind of philosophy that Plotinus is not. So they're not displaying a very good knowledge of philosophy. I think, but that was part of the appeal of the revolutionary aspect of psychoanalysis is that its opposition to philosophy, but it doesn't really help all that much, I don't think.
I agree, and thank you. And I look forward to. I was not aware of your work, and thank you to yourself for doing it, and Yanis for bringing it to my attention. So I look forward to engage.
Thank you.
Thank you, Christo. And I think that this was an interesting question because it actually brings the discussion on the Plotinian unconscious not only to the Freudian tradition but also to Jungian tradition and the collective unconscious, or I think also Lacan's idea of conscious as a language. This is a very interesting case that someone could actually compare the Plotinian account with the different expressions and manifestations of the unconscious in different psychoanalytic interpretations and thinkers. So thank you, Christo, for bringing also this very
that's a subject of another discussion and another paper, I think. I just wanted
to... I was ready to say that, John, that this is another paper, and this shows how rich is Plotinus' conception of the unconscious that actually starts developed as you start working on Freud and then going to other psychoanalytic traditions and see how relevant could be and how far it could be refined or reconsidered. And exactly as John said, it's another paper or maybe other papers that could actually see this connection between the philosophy of Plotinus and different aspects or divergences of the understanding of the unconscious today in this.
And there are people working on those aspects. There are people working on the connection between Plotinus and Carl Jung, and there's people working on Plotinus and Freud. So there's there seems to be a resurgence of interest in the subject recently, so which is a good thing.
Yes, it's really promising, and also as I noted, it shows how Plotinus thought, even if it goes along the traditional idea of these metaphysics and philosophy of mind, or some main aspects that you can recognize in classics and ancient philosophy. Actually, they approach modern discussions in such a different and fruitful way, and actually bring us new perspectives, new angles to consider of things that we are discussing right now.
Yeah, there's lots of different sort of disciplines that are addressing the same thing. I think. I mean, we're all interested in understanding how we tick. You have philosophy, you have psychoanalysis, you have different kinds of psychoanalysis and philosophy, you have cognitive science, you have philosophy of mind, you have all kinds of different disciplines that are basically searching for the same thing, I think, maybe in different terms.
Yes, exactly, I agree, and that is why this topic is very interesting on what we are working also here at the Institute, and how it brings different aspects of Plotinus philosophy, even from the ancient Neoplatonic tradition to our modern times, throughout the historical landscape that also John presented about the unconscious. Is there any other question? I think we are reaching the end of our discussion today.
Just a second.
There is